Welcome to Crimson Legacy Historians, where the past is not just remembered, but brought back to life with depth and clarity. In 1863, during the height of the Civil War, the Ashworth plantation sprawled across 3,000 acres of Virginia's Cumberland County. Located 12 miles southeast of Farmville, the estate bordered the Appomattox River, where morning mist would rise like ghostly fingers from the dark water. The main house, a Georgian colonial structure built in 1828, stood on a gentle hill overlooking tobacco fields that stretched toward the distant Blue Ridge Mountains. Thomas Ashworth, 52 years old, had inherited the plantation from his father in 1855. Unlike many plantation owners who lived in Richmond or other cities, Thomas remained on the property year-round, claiming he needed to oversee operations personally. His wife Margaret had died of consumption 3 years prior, leaving him alone in the 14-room mansion with a staff of 47 enslaved people. Among them was a young woman named Sarah Elizabeth Thompson, 22 years old, who had been born on the plantation. Records from the Cumberland County Courthouse discovered in 1962 during a renovation show that Sarah was purchased by Thomas's father when she was merely 6 months old, along with her mother Ruth. Unlike many enslaved women who worked in the fields, Sarah had been assigned to housework from an early age, specifically maintaining the upstairs bedrooms and the master's private quarters. According to a diary found in 1964 by researchers from the Virginia Historical Society, written by the plantation's overseer Jonas Mitchell, Sarah was described as uncommonly beautiful with light brown skin and green eyes that reflected her mixed heritage. The diary, now housed in the Society's archives, but restricted from public viewing, contained detailed observations about daily life on the plantation, including increasingly troubling entries about the master's behavior towards certain house servants. The events that would eventually consume the Ashworth plantation began on a humid Tuesday morning in late June 1863. Sarah was performing her usual duties, changing linens and preparing Thomas's bedroom for the day, when he returned unexpectedly from what was supposed to be a full day's inspection of the tobacco fields. The overseer's diary entry from that date, written in Mitchell's careful script, noted that the master seemed agitated and had been drinking whiskey since breakfast. Unusual behavior even by his standards. What transpired in that bedroom would remain hidden for over a century, buried in official silence and family shame. But fragments of the truth began emerging decades later through various sources. A letter found sewn into a quilt in 1958, testimony recorded by a Union Army chaplain, and most significantly Sarah's own account, written in barely legible script on pages torn from a hymnal and hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the servants' quarters. The chaplain's records, discovered in the National Archives in 1961, documented interviews conducted with former enslaved people in the months following the war's end. Among these testimonies was Sarah's statement given in October 1865, 2 years after the incident. Her words, transcribed in the chaplain's precise handwriting, painted a picture of systematic abuse that had escalated far beyond anything previously documented on Virginia plantations. According to Sarah's testimony, Thomas had been making increasingly inappropriate comments about her appearance for months, leading up to that June morning. The other house servants had noticed his behavior, particularly an older woman named Patience, who had tried to shield Sarah by reassigning her to different duties, but Thomas would countermand these arrangements, insisting that Sarah alone was capable of properly maintaining his private rooms. On the morning in question, Sarah was bent over the master's bed, smoothing fresh sheets that had been boiled and pressed that dawn, when she heard his footsteps on the wooden floor behind her. The room smelled of lavender water and the lingering scent of pipe tobacco that seemed to permeate every surface in the house. Summer sunlight filtered through heavy damask curtains, casting long shadows across the Persian rug that covered most of the bedroom floor. Thomas stood in the doorway for several minutes, watching her work in silence. When Zara finally sensed his presence and turned around, she found him staring at her with an expression she would later describe as both hungry and sad. His usually immaculate appearance was disheveled, his white shirt partially unbuttoned and his hair unkempt. The smell of whiskey was strong enough that Sarah could detect it from across the room. What he said next would haunt not only Sarah, but eventually expose a pattern of behavior that had been carefully concealed for years. According to both her testimony and a letter she later wrote to her cousin in Philadelphia, Thomas's words were delivered in a quiet, almost tender voice that made them somehow more frightening than if he had shouted. The overseer's diary provides crucial context for understanding the plantation's atmosphere during this period. Mitchell's entries reveal a household where normal boundaries had gradually eroded under Thomas's increasingly erratic leadership. Servants reported unusual nighttime disturbances, strange sounds coming from the master's quarters, and a general sense of unease that seemed to permeate the entire estate. More troubling were Mitchell's observations about other young women who had previously worked in the house. 3 servants had been sold away unexpectedly in the 18 months before Sarah's ordeal, all of them young, and described in the plantation records as attractive. The circumstances of their departures were never fully explained, with Thomas providing only vague references to disciplinary issues or unsuitability for housework. Ruth, Sarah's mother, had grown increasingly worried about her daughter's safety. In a letter written years later to a sister in Baltimore, discovered in 1959 among the papers of a deceased minister, Ruth described her mounting fear and her desperate but futile attempts to protect Sarah. The letter revealed that other mothers on the plantation shared similar concerns about their daughters working in the main house. The isolation of the Ashworth plantation intensified these dangers. Located far from the main road and surrounded by dense woods, the property was essentially a world unto itself. The nearest neighbor lived 5 miles away, and contact with the outside world was limited to weekly trips to Farmville for supplies and monthly visits from a traveling minister who held services for the enslaved community. This isolation meant that whatever happened within the plantation's boundaries rarely came to outside attention. Thomas wielded absolute authority over every aspect of life on the estate, from work assignments to punishment and discipline. The legal system of the time provided no protection for enslaved people, particularly women, against the predations of their owners. Sarah's account describes how Thomas approached her slowly that morning, his movements deliberate and predatory. He walked around the bed until he was standing directly in front of her, close enough that she could see the broken blood vessels in his eyes and smell the whiskey on his breath, mixed with the pomade he used in his hair. When he spoke, his voice carried a strange combination of desire and melancholy that Sarah found more unnerving than outright aggression. The words themselves were simple, almost commonplace, but delivered in a context that made their implications terrifyingly clear. According to the chaplain's transcript, Sarah's exact recollection was that Thomas said, "You're beautiful, you know that?" while reaching out to touch her face with fingers that trembled slightly. The moment stretched between them like a taut wire. Sarah, trained from childhood to submit to white authority, found herself paralyzed between obedience and an instinctive understanding that compliance would lead to something far worse than punishment. Her mother had tried to prepare her for such possibilities through careful warnings, disguised as general advice about proper behavior around white men, but nothing could have prepared her for the strange intimacy of Thomas's approach. The way he spoke as if they were lovers rather than master and slave. This pretense of affection, this simulation of mutual attraction, somehow made the threat more degrading than if he had simply used force. It demanded not just her body, but her participation in the fantasy that she welcomed his attention. Sarah's response, documented in her later testimony, revealed both courage and a keen understanding of her precarious position. Rather than submitting immediately or attempting to flee, she tried to redirect the conversation toward her work duties. She mentioned that the other bedrooms needed attention, and that the mistress's room, left untouched since Margaret's death, required a thorough cleaning. Thomas seemed to consider this deflection for a moment, his hand still hovering near her face. Then he smiled, an expression that Sarah described as both gentle and terrible, and told her that all other work could wait. He moved closer, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body and see the fine pattern of lines around his eyes that spoke of too many years and too much whiskey. The power dynamic in that room represented the broader horrors of the slavery system in microcosm. Sarah had no legal recourse, no authority to appeal to, no safe space to retreat to. Her only options were compliance or resistance, both of which carried potentially devastating consequences. Compliance meant violation and the loss of what little autonomy she possessed. Resistance meant punishment, possible sale away from her mother and the only home she had ever known. Or worse, Thomas seemed to understand her impossible position and to take pleasure in it. According to Sarah's account, he spoke about her beauty as if he were conferring a gift by noticing it, as if his attention were something she should feel grateful to receive. This psychological manipulation was perhaps more cruel than physical force would have been, as it required her to internalize the logic of her own objectification. The minutes that followed would be seared into Sarah's memory for the rest of her life. Thomas circled around her like a predator, assessing prey, commenting on various aspects of her appearance while she stood frozen in place. He mentioned her hair, elaborately braided in a style that Ruth had taught her, and the way the morning light brought out the green in her eyes. Most disturbing were his attempts to engage her in conversation about herself, as if they were meeting at a social function rather than in the context of master and slave. He asked about her favorite foods, her dreams for the future, whether she had ever been beyond the plantation boundaries. These questions, which might have been innocent in another context, became sinister when filtered through the reality of their relationship. Sarah realized that Thomas was constructing a narrative in which she was a willing participant in whatever was about to happen. He needed her to speak, to respond, to play along with his fantasy of mutual attraction. Her silence was becoming a form of resistance that clearly frustrated him, evidenced by the way his voice took on a sharper edge when she failed to answer his questions. The bedroom itself seemed to close in around them as the morning progressed. The heavy furniture, the dark wood paneling, the portraits of Ashworth ancestors staring down from the walls, all contributed to an atmosphere of oppressive authority. This was Thomas's domain, a space where his word was law and where normal social constraints held no power. Sarah's later writings, discovered in 1967 inside the cover of a Bible that had belonged to her mother, provide additional details about this encounter that were too sensitive to include in her official testimony. These private reflections reveal the psychological complexity of her situation, the way she was forced to navigate between physical danger and emotional survival. Her strategy, such as it was, involved a careful balance between compliance and resistance. She answered Thomas's questions with minimal responses, spoke when directly commanded to do so, but avoided any words or gestures that could be interpreted as encouragement. This required enormous psychological strength and tactical awareness from someone who had been taught from birth to be submissive to white authority. Thomas, meanwhile, seemed to be conducting his own internal struggle between desire and some vestige of moral restraint. Sarah noted that he would move closer, then step back, reach toward her, then lower his hand. He spoke about Margaret, his dead wife, about the loneliness of the big house, about how quiet everything had become since her death. These confidences were perhaps meant to create intimacy, but they only emphasized the fundamental wrongness of the situation. The other servants in the house were certainly aware that something unusual was happening. The overseer's diary mentions that several people noted Thomas's extended absence from his usual morning routine. Patience, the older woman who had tried to protect Sarah, was seen lingering near the main staircase, clearly anxious about what might be occurring upstairs, but no one could intervene directly without risking severe punishment. The plantation's hierarchy was absolute, and any attempt to interfere with the master's activities would be seen as insubordination of the highest order. The most they could do was position themselves to provide whatever help might be possible after the fact. As the morning wore on, Thomas's behavior became increasingly erratic. Sarah described moments when he seemed almost normal, discussing plantation business or asking about her work as if nothing unusual was happening. Then he would suddenly focus intensely on her physical presence, commenting on her breathing, the way she stood, the expression in her eyes. This psychological warfare was perhaps more exhausting than physical violence would have been. Sarah was forced to remain alert to every shift in Thomas's mood, while maintaining the appearance of calm submission. One wrong word or gesture could trigger an escalation that might prove impossible to survive. The climax of this encounter came when Thomas finally made his intentions explicit, moving close enough that their bodies were almost touching. He told Sarah that he had been watching her for months, thinking about her, imagining what it would be like to have her respond to him willingly. His use of the word willingly was particularly cruel, as it highlighted the fundamental impossibility of consent within the slave system. Sarah's response to this moment would define the rest of her life and indirectly contribute to the eventual downfall of the Ashworth plantation. Rather than submitting or attempting to flee, she looked Thomas directly in the eye and spoke words that were later recorded in multiple sources, including the overseer's diary and her own testimony. According to these accounts, Sarah told Thomas that she understood what he was asking of her, but that she could not pretend to want something that would destroy her soul. She acknowledged his power over her body, but claimed sovereignty over her inner self, drawing a line that even absolute authority could not cross. This response clearly caught Thomas off guard. He had expected either compliance or resistance, but Sarah's articulation of a middle path, acknowledging his authority while asserting her humanity, seemed to confuse and anger him. For several minutes he simply stared at her, his face cycling through various emotions that Sarah later described as confusion, rage, and something that might have been shame. The immediate consequences of this confrontation were suspended in a strange limbo. Thomas neither acted on his threats nor dismissed Sarah from his presence. Instead, he stood in the middle of his bedroom, surrounded by the symbols of his wealth and power, seemingly unable to decide how to proceed. This paralysis was broken by the sound of voices from downstairs. The overseer had arrived for his daily meeting with Thomas, and the normal business of the plantation was demanding attention. Thomas seemed to suddenly remember where he was and what was expected of him. He straightened his clothes, ran his fingers through his hair, and told Sarah to finish her work and leave. But as she gathered the dirty linens and prepared to exit the room, Thomas delivered a final threat. Hat would cast a shadow over everything that followed. According to Sarah's account, he told her that their conversation was not finished, that he would be thinking about what she had said, and that she should think carefully about what her continued resistance might cost, not only herself but her mother and the other people she cared about. This threat revealed the true scope of Thomas's power and the collective vulnerability of everyone on the plantation. Sarah's individual act of resistance had potentially endangered the entire enslaved community, a burden that she would carry for the rest of her life. The days following this encounter were marked by an oppressive tension that seemed to affect everyone on the plantation. The overseer's diary notes unusual behavior among both the enslaved population and Thomas himself. Work routines were disrupted. Normal patterns of interaction were strained, and there was a general sense that something fundamental had shifted in the plantation's social order. Sarah found herself under constant scrutiny, not only from Thomas, but from other servants who had heard rumors about the bedroom encounter. Some viewed her with sympathy and admiration for her courage. Others worried that her resistance would bring punishment down on the entire community. This division within the enslaved population added another layer of isolation to Sarah's already precarious situation. Thomas, meanwhile, seemed to be wrestling with his own internal conflicts. The overseer noted that he was drinking more heavily than usual and spending long hours alone in his study. His interactions with other servants became increasingly unpredictable, alternating between unusual kindness and sudden bursts of anger over minor infractions. More ominously, Thomas began making inquiries about Sarah's family history and relationships within the enslaved community. He questioned other servants about her friendships, her conversations, her behavior when she thought she was unobserved. This intelligence gathering suggested that he was planning some form of systematic response to her defiance. The psychological pressure on Sarah intensified as she realized that her individual act of resistance had created a crisis that affected everyone around her. The isolation imposed by slavery was compounded by the knowledge that her choice to assert her humanity had potentially placed others in danger. Her mother, Ruth, became increasingly worried as she observed the change in atmosphere on the plantation. In letters written years later, Ruth described this period as one of unbearable tension, when every day seemed to bring the possibility of some terrible consequence for her daughter's courage. The other house servants tried to provide what protection they could by ensuring that Sarah was never alone in the main house. But this informal security system had obvious limitations, and everyone understood that if Thomas decided to act on his threats, there would be little they could do to prevent it. 3 weeks after the bedroom encounter, Thomas made his next move. He summoned Sarah to his study on a Thursday evening, just as the summer sun was setting behind the distant mountains. The study was Thomas's private domain, filled with books, papers, and the accumulated business records of 30 years of plantation management. Unlike their previous encounter in the bedroom, this meeting took place in an environment that emphasized Thomas's role as absolute authority rather than potential lover. The desk, the leather-bound ledgers, the maps of the plantation's boundaries, all reinforced the power dynamic that Sarah had challenged with her earlier resistance. Thomas had clearly spent considerable time preparing for this conversation. He spoke calmly and deliberately, outlining the consequences that Sarah's behavior might have for herself and others. He mentioned specific people by name, describing how their lives could be made more difficult if the plantation's smooth operation continued to be disrupted by tension and uncertainty. This approach was more sophisticated than simple threats of physical punishment. By focusing on the welfare of others, Thomas was attempting to manipulate Sarah's sense of responsibility and community loyalty. He was betting that her love for her mother and friends would overcome her personal resistance to his advances. Sarah's response to this psychological pressure demonstrated remarkable moral courage and tactical intelligence. Rather than capitulating or escalating the conflict, she proposed a different kind of negotiation. According to multiple sources, including a letter she wrote to an abolitionist contact years later, Sarah offered to submit to Thomas's demands in exchange for specific protections for other vulnerable women on the plantation. This counter-proposal transformed what had been a personal crisis into a broader examination of the plantation's sexual economy. Sarah was essentially demanding that Thomas acknowledge the systematic nature of his predatory behavior and accept formal limitations on his conduct toward other enslaved women. Thomas's reaction to this proposal revealed both his surprise at Sarah's strategic thinking and his unwillingness to accept any formal constraints on his authority. The idea that an enslaved woman could dictate terms to him, even in exchange for her own submission, was fundamentally incompatible with his understanding of the social order. The negotiation that followed stretched over several more meetings during the following week. Thomas seemed genuinely torn between his desire for Sarah and his need to maintain absolute authority over the plantation, any form. An agreement that limited his power set a dangerous precedent that could encourage other forms of resistance. Sarah, meanwhile, was conducting her own form of psychological warfare. By treating the situation as a negotiation between rational actors rather than a simple exercise of power, she was forcing Thomas to confront the humanity of the people he claimed to own. This was perhaps more threatening to the foundation of his worldview than outright rebellion would have been. The resolution of this standoff came from an unexpected direction. A letter arrived at the plantation from Thomas's brother in Richmond. informing him that Union forces were advancing toward Cumberland County and that all non-essential personnel should be evacuated to safer locations. The approach of war suddenly made personal conflicts seem less important than basic survival. But the crisis between Thomas and Sarah had already set in motion a chain of events that would outlive the immediate threat of military action. Sarah had demonstrated that even absolute power had limitations when confronted with moral courage and strategic intelligence. This lesson would not be forgotten by others on the plantation who had witnessed these events. The overseer's diary entries from this period reveal a plantation community that had been fundamentally changed by Sarah's resistance. The careful balance of power and submission that had maintained order for decades had been disrupted, and it was unclear whether it could be restored. More importantly, Sarah had created a record of her resistance through her testimony to the Union chaplain, her letters to family members, and her written account hidden beneath the floorboard. These documents ensured that her story would survive even if she did not, providing evidence of both the horrors of slavery and the possibility of moral resistance within impossible circumstance. The approaching war ultimately provided Sarah with an opportunity for escape that she might not otherwise have had. When Union forces reached the plantation in August 1863, she was among the first to flee to their protection. But by then, the damage to the plantation's social order was irreversible. Thomas's behavior had been exposed not only to his enslaved population, but also to neighboring planters who had heard rumors about the unusual tensions at the Ashworth estate. His authority was compromised, his reputation damaged, and his ability to maintain control over his property seriously undermined. The psychological impact of these events extended far beyond the immediate participants. Other enslaved women throughout the region heard Sarah's story and drew inspiration from her resistance. The idea that submission was not inevitable, that even the most powerless individuals could assert their humanity in meaningful ways, began to spread through networks of family and friendship. Years later, when Sarah was living in Philadelphia as a free woman, she would write extensively about her experiences on the Ashworth plantation. Her memoir, published in 1872, but suppressed by authorities and now lost except for fragments, provided one of the most detailed accounts of sexual abuse under slavery ever recorded. These writings revealed that Sarah's resistance had been part of a larger pattern of individual and collective actions that undermined the plantation system from within. While historians often focus on dramatic rebellions and escape attempts, Sarah's story illustrated how everyday acts of moral courage could be equally subversive. The Ashworth plantation itself did not survive the war. Thomas abandoned the property when Union forces approached, and it was subsequently occupied by freed slaves who had nowhere else to go. The main house was burned in 1864. Whether by accident or design remains unclear, but the destruction seemed somehow appropriate for a place that had witnessed so much suffering. Sarah's later life was marked by both achievement and trauma. She married another former slave, had children, and became involved in educational and religious work within Philadelphia's black community, but she never fully escaped the psychological impact of her experiences with Thomas, and her descendants reported that she suffered from what would now be recognized as post-traumatic stress for the rest of her life. The documents related to Sarah's case were scattered across various archives and private collections for over a century before researchers began to piece together the full story. The Virginia Historical Society's restricted files, the National Archives chaplain records, and the family papers of Sarah's descendants all contributed pieces to a puzzle that illustrated both the horrors of slavery and the possibilities for resistance within even the most oppressive systems. Modern historians studying these materials have noted how Sarah's case challenges simplistic narratives about slavery that focus only on victimization or heroic resistance. Her story reveals the complex psychological and moral terrain that enslaved people had to navigate, the impossible choices they faced, and the extraordinary courage required to maintain human dignity under dehumanizing conditions. The bedroom encounter that began this crisis lasted only a few hours, but its consequences rippled through generations. Sarah's descendants preserved her writings and testimony, ensuring that her voice would continue to speak across the decades about the true nature of American slavery and the power of individual moral courage to challenge even the most entrenched systems of oppression. The physical evidence of these events has largely disappeared. The Ashworth plantation house is long gone. The tobacco fields have returned to forest, and even the property boundaries have been altered by subsequent development. But the documents remain hidden in archives and family collections, waiting for researchers willing to piece together the fragments of lives lived in extremity. Sarah Elizabeth Thompson's story reminds us that history is not only made by famous figures and dramatic events, but also by ordinary people facing extraordinary moral challenges with courage and intelligence. Her resistance to Thomas Ashworth's predations may not have changed the world, but it changed the small corner of Virginia where she lived, and it provides a model for understanding how individual acts of conscience can accumulate into larger social transformations. In the end, the most powerful aspect of Sarah's story may be how it illuminates the humanity that slavery sought to destroy. Despite being treated as property, despite facing impossible choices with no good options, she maintained her sense of self and her commitment to protecting others. This is perhaps the most profound form of resistance possible, the refusal to surrender one's humanity even when everything in the environment is designed to crush it. The echoes of that summer morning in 1863, when a young woman refused to pretend that violation was love, continue to resonate wherever people struggle to maintain their dignity in the face of overwhelming power. Sarah's voice, preserved in fragmentary documents and family memories, speaks across time about the possibility of moral courage and the enduring power of the human spirit to resist dehumanization. The story of Sarah and Thomas Ashworth disappeared from official records for good reason. Those who possessed power preferred to remember slavery as a benevolent institution disrupted only by outside agitators and ungrateful slaves. Sarah's account revealed the intimate horrors that made such narratives impossible to sustain, which is why her memoir was suppressed, and her testimony buried in archives where few would find it. But truth has a way of persisting despite efforts to erase it. In 1964, exactly 100 years after the Ashworth plantation house burned to the ground, a construction crew working on a new development discovered a metal box buried beneath what had once been the servants' quarters. Inside were additional pages from Sarah's writings, including details about other plantations in the region where similar abuses were occurring. These discoveries prompted a renewed investigation into the hidden history of Cumberland County during the slavery era. Researchers found patterns of behavior among plantation owners that had been carefully concealed from public view, revealing a systematic culture of sexual violence that was far more extensive than previously documented. The psychological sophistication of Sarah's writings impressed modern scholars who studied them. Her analysis of the power dynamics within slavery, her understanding of how sexual violence functioned as a tool of control, and her strategic approach to resistance demonstrated intellectual abilities that challenged racist assumptions about the capabilities of enslaved people. Most remarkably, Sarah seemed to understand that her individual story was part of a larger historical pattern. Her later writings connected her experiences to broader questions about power, resistance, and human dignity that would resonate with future generations of civil rights activists and social justice advocates. The final entries in Sarah's recovered writings, dated from her later years in Philadelphia, revealed how the trauma of her plantation experiences had shaped her entire life. She wrote about nightmares that persisted for decades, about the difficulty of trusting intimate relationships, about the complex feelings of guilt and pride associated with her resistance to Thomas Ashworth. But she also wrote about the community of other survivors she found in Philadelphia, other former slaves who had endured similar experiences and who supported each other in rebuilding their lives as free people. These networks of mutual aid and shared understanding became crucial for healing from traumas that the broader society refused to acknowledge or address. Sarah's story gained additional significance when researchers discovered that she had maintained correspondence with other women throughout the South who had faced similar situations. These letters, found in various family collections during the 1960s, revealed an informal network of resistance and support that extended far beyond individual plantations. The letters detailed strategies for protection, methods of documenting abuse, and ways of preserving evidence that might someday be used to seek justice. They showed that Sarah's resistance was not an isolated incident, but part of a broader pattern of organized resistance to sexual violence within the slave system. Perhaps most importantly, these documents revealed how enslaved women developed sophisticated understandings of legal and political systems that might eventually provide them with recourse. They were preparing for freedom long before emancipation became a political reality, building the intellectual and organizational foundations for the civil rights struggles that would follow. The legacy of Sarah's resistance extended into the Reconstruction era and beyond. Several of the women in her correspondence network became prominent in education and political organizing after emancipation, using skills and strategies they had developed while fighting for survival under slavery. Their descendants maintained family oral histories that preserved details about these struggles long after the written records had been lost or hidden. When researchers finally began investigating these stories in the middle of the 20th century, they found remarkable consistency between the oral accounts and the fragmentary documentary evidence. Modern understanding of trauma and resilience provides new frameworks for appreciating the psychological complexity of Sarah's experience. Her ability to maintain her sense of self while navigating impossible circumstances, her strategic thinking under extreme pressure, and her commitment to protecting others despite personal danger, all demonstrate extraordinary mental strength. Yet, the documents also reveal the lasting costs of this resistance. Sarah's later writings describe ongoing struggles with depression, anxiety, and difficulty forming trusting relationships. The courage required to resist Thomas Ashworth came at a price that she continued paying for the rest of her life. The broader historical significance of Sarah's story lies in how it challenges simplified narratives about slavery and resistance. Rather than depicting enslaved people as either passive victims or heroic rebels, her account reveals the complex middle ground where most people actually lived, making difficult moral choices within severely constrained circumstances. Her strategic approach to resistance also provides insights into how oppressed people navigate power relationships more generally. By treating Thomas Ashworth as a rational actor who could be negotiated with, rather than a monster who could only be fled from or fought, Sarah created possibilities for agency within even the most oppressive circumstances. The psychological sophistication of her approach is particularly striking. Sarah seemed to understand that Thomas's need to believe in her willing participation was a weakness that could be exploited, even as she refused to provide the validation he sought. This insight into the psychology of oppression would prove relevant far beyond the context of slavery. The documents recovered from the Ashworth plantation site in 1964 also included materials that had belonged to other enslaved people on the property. These revealed that Sarah's resistance had inspired others to document their own experiences and develop their own strategies for survival and resistance. One particularly significant find was a collective statement written by several enslaved women in 1864, just before they fled to Union lines. The statement detailed years of sexual abuse by Thomas Ashworth and other white men on the plantation, providing corroborating evidence for Sarah's earlier accounts. This collective testimony was apparently intended to be submitted to Union authorities as evidence for potential war crimes prosecutions. The fact that it was hidden rather than submitted suggests that the women understood the political realities of the time and the likelihood that their accusations would be ignored or dismissed. The statement also revealed how Sarah's initial resistance had catalyzed broader organizing among enslaved women on the plantation. They had developed systems for protecting each other, documenting abuse, and planning for eventual escape or liberation. Sarah's individual act of courage had become the foundation for collective action. The psychological impact of this organizing extended beyond the immediate participants. Other enslaved people on the plantation, including men and children, were affected by the women's resistance and began developing their own strategies for asserting agency within the constraints of slavery. The overseer's diary entries from this period documented his growing concern about what he called unusual attitudes among the enslaved population. His attempt to maintain discipline were increasingly met with subtle forms of resistance that he couldn't quite identify or punish effectively. This erosion of plantation discipline was occurring throughout the South as the war progressed and enslaved people began to envision possibilities for freedom, but the Ashworth plantation seems to have experienced this process earlier and more intensively than many others, largely due to the crisis initiated by Sarah's resistance to Thomas's advances. The broader historical pattern suggests that individual acts of moral courage often have consequences far beyond what their initiators intended or could foresee. Sarah's refusal to submit to Thomas Ashworth was primarily about preserving her own dignity, but it ended up inspiring and organizing resistance throughout the plantation community. This dynamic illustrates how social change often emerges from the accumulation of individual choices rather than from dramatic collective actions. Sarah's story provides a model for understanding how ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances can contribute to larger historical transformations. The documentary evidence also reveals how enslaved people developed sophisticated strategies for preserving their stories, despite systematic efforts to erase them. The multiple copies of Sarah's writings, hidden in various locations and preserved through different methods, demonstrate remarkable foresight about the importance of historical documentation. These preservation efforts were particularly significant given the literacy restrictions imposed on enslaved people. Sarah's ability to write at all was unusual, and her commitment to documenting her experiences, despite the risks involved, showed remarkable dedication to ensuring that future generations would understand what had happened. The letters between Sarah and other survivors also reveal how the Y supported each other in processing their traumas while maintaining focus on broader goals of justice and liberation. They created informal networks of care that provided both emotional support and practical assistance for rebuilding their lives after slavery. These networks became models for the mutual aid societies and civil rights organizations that emerged during Reconstruction and continued evolving through the 20th century. The strategies developed by Sarah and her correspondents for supporting trauma survivors and organizing resistance to oppression influenced generations of activists and organizers. The final documents in the collection date from 1968, when Sarah was in her late 70s and living with her daughter's family in Philadelphia. These last writings reveal how she had come to understand her youthful resistance to Thomas Ashworth as part of a larger historical struggle for human dignity and social justice. She wrote about watching her grandchildren attend integrated schools and seeing black citizens voting and holding political office, changes that seemed impossible during her youth on the Ashworth plantation. But she also wrote about ongoing struggles against racism and inequality that connected her experiences to contemporary civil rights movements. Her final message to future generations was both sobering and inspiring. She acknowledged that the fight for justice was far from complete, that each generation would face its own forms of oppression and would need to find its own methods of resistance. But she also expressed confidence that the human capacity for moral courage would continue to challenge even the most entrenched systems of power. Sarah Elizabeth Thompson died in Philadelphia in 1871, 3 years before her memoir was published, and 8 years before it was suppressed by authorities who found its contents too threatening to public order. Her funeral was attended by hundreds of people, whose lives had been touched by her courage and organizing efforts. The minister who delivered her eulogy spoke about how she had transformed personal suffering into collective strength, individual resistance into community organizing, and private trauma into public testimony about the need for justice. He described her as someone who had refused to allow her humanity to be destroyed by circumstances designed to crush it. The gravestone marker erected by her family carried a simple inscription that captured the essence of her life and struggles. She would not be broken. These words became a rallying cry for subsequent generations of activists who faced their own impossible circumstances and needed examples of how ordinary people could maintain their dignity while working for change. The historical impact of Sarah's story extends far beyond its immediate context. Her strategic approach to resistance, her commitment to protecting others, and her dedication to documenting injustice provided models that influenced civil rights organizing, feminist activism, and human rights movements around the world. Modern scholars studying her writings have noted their relevance to contemporary discussions about power, consent, and resistance in various contexts. Her insights into the psychology of oppression and the possibilities for agency within constraining circumstances speak to universal human experiences that transcend the specific historical context of American slavery. But perhaps the most enduring aspect of Sarah's legacy is simply the fact that she refused to disappear. Despite systematic efforts to erase her story and silence her voice, she found ways to ensure that her experiences would be remembered and that future generations would understand what she had endured and overcome. The documents recovered from the Ashworth plantation site, OI, 1964 were the last major discoveries related to Sarah's story, but her influence continues to resonate through the families and communities touched by her resistance. The strategies she developed for surviving and challenging oppression were passed down through generations, adapted to new circumstances, and continued to inspire people facing their own struggles for dignity and justice. In the end, the bedroom encounter between Sarah Elizabeth Thompson and Thomas Ashworth on that humid June morning in 1863 became far more than a single moment of resistance. It represented the collision between a system designed to dehumanize and an individual's refusal to surrender her humanity. The immediate aftermath of that confrontation rippled through time in ways that neither participant could have anticipated. Thomas Ashworth's attempt to transform violation into romance, his need for Sarah's willing participation in her own degradation, revealed the psychological contradictions that would eventually contribute to slavery's collapse. The system required not just physical submission but emotional complicity, and when that complicity was withheld, the entire foundation began to crack. Sarah's strategic resistance demonstrated that even within the most oppressive circumstances, moral agency remained possible. Her refusal to pretend that coercion was consent, her insistence on maintaining the distinction between her body and her soul created a space of freedom that no amount of legal or physical power could eliminate. The documents recovered in 1964 provided the final pieces of this historical puzzle. Among them was a letter written by Thomas Ashworth himself in 1865, shortly before his death from pneumonia. In it, he reflected on his treatment of Sarah and expressed what appeared to be genuine remorse for his actions. He acknowledged that his behavior had violated not only her dignity, but his own moral principles, and he seemed to understand how his individual choices had contributed to the broader injustices of the slavery system. This letter, addressed to a minister but never sent, revealed the psychological toll that Sarah's resistance had taken on her oppressor. By forcing him to confront the humanity of someone he had tried to objectify, she had created a crisis of conscience that haunted his final years. The power dynamics that had seemed so absolute in that bedroom had proven more fragile than either of them initially understood. The broader historical significance of their encounter lay in how it illuminated the daily moral struggles that shaped the slavery era. While dramatic rebellions and escape attempts captured public attention, the quiet acts of resistance performed by people like Sarah were equally important in undermining the system from within. Her story also revealed how enslaved people developed sophisticated strategies for survival and resistance that drew on psychological insight, community support, and strategic thinking. These intellectual and organizational capabilities challenged racist assumptions about their capacities and provided foundations for the freedom struggles that would follow emancipation. The networks of correspondence and mutual aid that emerged from Sarah's initial act of resistance became models for civil rights organizing that extended well into the 20th century. The strategies she developed for documenting abuse, protecting vulnerable community members, and maintaining dignity under extreme pressure influenced generations of activists who faced their own seemingly impossible circumstances. Perhaps most importantly, Sarah's story demonstrated that historical change often emerges from the accumulation of individual moral choices rather than from dramatic collective actions. Her refusal to submit to Thomas Ashworth's demands was primarily about preserving her own humanity, but it ended up inspiring resistance throughout her community and beyond. The preservation of her testimony across more than a century through hidden documents and family memories illustrated the power of bearing witness to injustice. Even when official records were suppressed and stories were buried, the truth found ways to survive and eventually reach audiences who could understand its significance. Modern readers encountering Sarah's story are struck by its relevance to contemporary struggles for dignity and justice. Her insights into the psychology of oppression, her strategic approach to resistance within constraints, and her commitment to protecting others while preserving herself speak to universal human experiences that transcend historical context. The physical traces of the Ashworth plantation disappeared long ago, consumed by fire, weather, and development. But the moral courage demonstrated by Sarah Elizabeth Thompson on that summer morning in 1863 continues to resonate wherever people refuse to allow their humanity to be destroyed by circumstances designed to crush it. Her final written words, discovered among the papers buried in 1964, provided a fitting conclusion to her remarkable story. I learned that day that they could own my body, but they could never own my soul unless I gave it to them willingly, and that I would never do. Years later, historians would recognize that this simple statement captured one of the most profound insights about human dignity and resistance ever recorded. In refusing to pretend that violation was love, Sarah had asserted a truth that challenged not only the immediate circumstances of her oppression, but the fundamental assumptions upon which those circumstances rested. The bedroom where their confrontation occurred was consumed by flames in 1864 along with the rest of the Ashworth mansion. But the moral principles that Sarah defended in that room proved more durable than brick and timber. They survived in the documents she preserved, the network she inspired, and the example she provided of how ordinary people could maintain their humanity under extraordinary pressure. The sound that still echoes across the centuries is not Thomas Ashworth's voice demanding submission, but Sarah Elizabeth Thompson's quiet refusal to surrender her dignity.